Hi, this is Bharat Pathyji. This is day 3 of the class on Hiroshima after 80 years that I did for Osher USF in person. But due to personal conflicts, not everybody can attend it. So I generally would like to record it on Zoom and share it with those who are interested but miss the class. Okay, so here we go. In the last class, after the development of H-bomb, and the early days post Manhattan, we talked about the Cold War and the arms race that started due to the fact that the Soviets managed to catch up very quickly, primarily due to uh, their man on the inside, Klaus Fuchs, and also their own scientists whose abilities were grossly underestimated by the U.S. establishment, and at the same time, the spread of communist control or the Eastern Bloc over Eastern Europe, and the famous or infamous telegram that was sent by our man in Moscow, George Kennan, and that changed started the whole race. And this were the McCarthy era with the communist witch hunt. So, and the arms race took off very quickly from 3 bombs in 1946. We were already up to the thousands by 1961 at great expense and great risk, with the naivety that we could protect and actually survive the attack by duck and cover maneuvers and swallowing iodine tablets. And in the very first class, I had talked about the horrors that could occur from Annie Jacobson's book, where a US president has only 6 minutes. And with the current weapons, the destruction would be horrid. Okay, and it's the cloud and the long-term effects, such as the hole in the ozone layer and the cooling of the planets, would cover not just one continent but the entire world. Okay, so that's summarizing enough about it. Okay, and now in this class I showed some videos which I may not be able to upload on YouTube due to copyrights. Okay, now at the same time, this was for good measures during at the height of Cold War. This wasn't the only uh, weapons of mass destruction, but I'm reading a book called Airborne by Carl Zimmer, and that talks about the biological warfare and the research that went on in using biological weapons. But that's another story in another class. And just to show that how the pollution for radiation was hidden from the general public. Similarly, you know, experiment with releasing potentially dangerous microorganisms was done in San Francisco Harbor, and several people died due to infections. So, but now this is, I always like to summarize as to what is in the news, and this somehow it did not make a big splash in the United States because there were so many things happening with the barrage of announcement from the Trump administration and the tariff, but China actually mastered the technology that arrives them to a thermonuclear bluff. So this is something that's called hydrogen bomb without nuclear resources. Now one can wonder how that can be done, but by using a special chemical called magnesium hydride. And for the first time in controlled field test, they were able to create a sort of chain reaction with great explosive power than conventional TNT, and generating the proverbial fireball that exceeds 1,000 degrees Celsius temperature for more than few seconds. So this is 15 times longer than equivalent TNT blast. And this can be a big game changer for armaments, and not just in the ballistic missiles, artillery, and air-to-air missiles. So that's something to be reckoned with. And this is a video from one of the Indian sources, but I'm not going to play it because it may be hindered by, you could see this is WION is one of the Indian news agencies. Don't know what the abbreviation stand for, but there are similar ones, but I give you the gist of it, that the technology is something called magnesium hydride, which is a chemical with magnesium and hydrogen, two molecules, and that is highly explosive. And okay, I think so. I'll skip that for. What is another interesting thing is the last time I showed a book about nuclear energy written by a Dutch scientist. Okay, and he talks about the nuclear energy in reactors. Now, the main reactors that were used for plutonium manufacturing were cooling water or boiling water type, and the graphite rods technology that was employed at Hansford and other reactors. And that has been the main workstay. But the Chinese have again shocked the world with building a thorium molten salt reactor. This is not a new discovery by any means. This was tried by the nuclear agency in the United States in 1960s, and the operating reactor was used at Oak Ridge for several years. And for some reasons that I could not discover, that was finally shut down. But this is the new way of using thorium, which by itself is not, the native isotope is not radioactive, but that can be used by bombarding it with neutron, changing the isotope formation, and then it degenerates into another heavy element called protoactinium, and that in turn generates uranium-233, and so that can be it can be you breed nuclear fuel from rare earth waste. Okay, so thorium is rather abundant. Now this factors more into the Indian nuclear attempt, but that you'll have to wait for that story when I get to that point, how other nations acquired the reactors. Okay, I mean, and it was part of the colonial legacy. Okay, but so this is another development, and that can be again a way of generating electricity for the massive demand that is likely to occur with artificial intelligence and data mining. Okay, and last but not the least, in the news item, the Kashmir terrorist attack again, brings two nuclear power nations, India and Pakistan, on the brink of war, and that is news summary. Now, these are I did not dwell on the reactor types, but these are the main types of reactors. There are several of them, as you can see on the list on the left side, but the most common ones are the pressurized water reactor and the boiling reactor and the heavy water reactor. So those are common in all the major nations, and but the other ones are rather rare, So, the air gas cooled reactor, the Brits tried, and they gave up on it now. They've closed it down. And then there are also some which are using helium, which is, another complex technology, which I won't be able to get too much into it. And because I haven't had, incentive to research it. But the most common ones are the heavy water type. Okay, and that is one of the reasons why the Germans never succeeded. As you may recall, I mentioned last time that the Norwegian heavy water plant was bombed, and that was the end of it. Okay. Okay. All right. So continued. I hope I'm recording, because when you're talking by yourself, it's hard to say whether it is occurring or not. Okay. All right. So I'll pause it just for a few seconds and restart it to make sure. Okay, let's see. Should have record button here somewhere. Okay, yeah, I think it is recording. So, okay, so yeah. Okay, so we are recording. I just verified it, because that's the nightmare scenario that. Okay, and these are the two types of reactors. You can just see this nice sketch diagrams that talks the heavy water type, which is the very common one, which has the control rod, which are the graphite rod that are inserted, and that controls the reaction that takes place, and eventually the basic process of that goes back to early days of turbines and Westinghouse, which defeated Edison. The steam is generated and rotates the turbine, and then magnets and electricity is generated. Similarly, the other water code type, it's also, the steam pressure is generated and the fuel elements are heated, and in general, control rods. And so there are varieties of type of reactions that are taking place. Okay, and this, and now I'm not going to show this again due to concerns about copyright, but due to a heavy demand for artificial intelligence, the big tech companies are initiating the nuclear reactors which were closed down, including the infamous 3 Mile Island. And now, obviously, they have their deep pockets and they'll be able to do, the checking. But at the same time, there are other people who are on the other side, are worried about as to that it won't be rehearsed. So, but this is one of the projects. There are several reactors which are decommissioned or were closed down due to perhaps unjustified fear that the tech companies are interested in producing more and more electricity, okay, for data processing centers, because they are one data processing center can consume as much electricity as a small city. Okay, so I think later on, after I stop this recording, I will go over some of these if time permits. Okay, all right, so this is, enough segue into reactor. No. Now, this is again just for entertainment. Most of you who have watched the premium channels called HBO would recognize this Brit. Okay, and we talked about the waste that took place during the Manhattan Project at a place called Hanford, Washington, but the huge amount of Columbia River was polluted, and the amount of compensation and that has been given the workers, that's a staggering $1.5 billion. And these are not huge numbers. We are not talking about whole city of Seattle, which is, these are small towns in Western Washington. I'm sorry, Eastern Washington. My mistake. Okay, and this is a humorous series. This is a 10-year-old episode by John Oliver, where he exposes the mismanagement that takes place in our nuclear arsenal as to how the technology is old. One massive door, which is supposed to attack the silos, cannot be closed due to lack of parts. So it is jerry-rigged open by a crowbar. Okay, that's enough said about the security. And he shows about the floppies they are using, not just the 1-inch floppies that were there in the early days, but the 8-inch floppies that are being used. So the code that is being transmitted are still written on technology circa 60s. And then he talks about some of the cheating that goes on in people who are working in the silos when they are to take the test, how they are cheating and copying their answers to qualify to work there. And the last but not the least, even a general who is in a Russian party, he is drunk and misbehaves. So this is, this story is just a big expose as to how poorly maintained. And then he talks about some of the doors of the silos that were left open. And lay citizens actually pointed that out, that the door to the missile bays, where the silo is actually open. So that just does not generate too much confidence in our government to manage its security. Okay, but that's a nice segue with his humorous start. And if you have time, you can just look it up yourself. I'll share the links. But okay, so this is, we'll just skip over that. Now, at the same time, that we already talked about the 3 main countries, Britain, who started the whole idea, but did not want to finance it during the Second World War, United States, and on its tail with the spying the Soviet Union. The 3 countries were already nuclear powers by the early 50s. But the Chinese, after the Communist Revolution, Mao Zedong, wanted to acquire nuclear weapons, and he asked the Russians to help, and the Russians were wisely, or they were not anxious to share the technology, and the Chinese had their own clever physicist who had come for education in United States, and this one that needs to be mentioned was, I'm not going to mispronounce the name, but you can read it for yourself and make your own pronunciation. And this man was a rocket scientist. He was working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory on the West Coast, but during the early days of communist everywhere, the director suspected that there was a spy ring that was going on, and his suspicion extended as well. All of them are either Chinese or Jewish, and just shows his bias. And then this man was actually deported and went on to become the so-called father of the missile technology, okay, of their era. Now, to be fair to them, we have to cut them zigzag that this was the heydays of communist spies, and the United States was badly burned by Klaus Fuchs and other Rosenberg family things. So, and he was initially placed under house arrest, and that he was not a dedicated communist, but later on, obviously, joined the party and was rose through the management and became the principal scientist of rocket scientist in China. Okay, so interesting sideway. Okay, and I had sent out a series of the timeline that I was able to find, and this just traces the history of what happened and when and why, so to speak. So I will have interspersed some of the slides in between. Now, we talked about during the early days, this was the Castle Bravo, the big, huge bomb within the bomb, fission fusion type of thing that was exploded and in the Pacifics and atoll, and this required cooling with liquefied nitrogen, and that was not something that could be dropped, but that was the proof of concept, and that started the whole thermonuclear age. Okay, this was followed by the more deliverable device, that was the next generation of bombs that took place, and this was the small island of Eniwetok was totally wiped out with the Mike test, and the scientists were aghast that it produced a lot more bang for their buck than they were climbing on, and people who were 40 miles away felt the heat and the shock waves, and the small Japanese ship, or fishing boat rather, not a ship, was there, or was exposed to radiation. But I mentioned that last time. Okay, and here is, I did not cover that. I mentioned that the sailors were, saw that there was white rain that was falling on them, for several hours, and they had no idea, and they actually rubbed their faces in it. Little they realized they were exposing themselves to lethal radiation. And so this just shows the distance from the ground zero and the amount of radiation that takes place. Even any radiation can be hazardous, and the actual requirement is in single digits, that recommended safety level. But you can see it in the red zone, people receive 3,000 radiation rads, and there are various ways in the radioactivity is measured, rads, RAMs, that is actually absorbed in the skin. And now the new criteria is called Sievert. Okay, and this is the name of the unfortunate ship, which was called Little Dragon. The Japanese name is there on the top. And these were some of the islands which were involved in Operation Bravo, Rongelap, okay, and the Bikini Islands are further away, and that became famous with the swimsuit that was designed in France, okay, based on the natives. So that's another side story, okay. And these islanders are not able to return them for a number of years, and they were given some small compensation at the end. And they suffered a lot more radiation than they had bargained for, and a lot of them, had developed radioactive, their hair loss, bleaching, burning, sores, so varieties of things that occurred. Now, at the same time, on the other side, the movement for third worlds or non neutral nations, they were neither communist nor capitalist, was taking place in a place called Bandung that was led by the leaders of the so-called Third World, which included Jawaharlal Nehru, Sukarno, the president of Indonesia, Abdul Gamal Nasser, and Nkrumah from Russia. So there were parts, but the policy of the West and the East was either you're with us or against us. So, and so this is, another sidestep story for those of you who are not familiar with the events in the world history. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have a slide for it, but just to put it in proper perspective. Okay, and now at the same time, one has to give credit to United Nations that did establish, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and there was a general conference that was held 1957 under the auspices of United Nations. And so there were attempts made to control this monster that the two major powers had released, But again, that did not have any teeth, and it made some attempts. But again, as we shall see, there are a number of nations having nuclear weapons have increased substantially, okay, over the decades, okay. And those of you who grew up in the United States or the worldwide, when the Russian released a relatively small globe into the outer space, and there was a Sputnik moment that took place, and that sent shockwaves through the Western world, primarily because they just showed that the Russians had capability of delivering missiles from space, and that started not just the Strategic Air Command, with the aim of which was to deliver bombs directly on a smaller and bigger target over the enemy, but this was the development of missile technology from space, and that started another race. And just to bring it to to modern times, the second Sputnik moment, which was in the news recently, was when China and Russia both tested hypersonic missiles that go at several times faster than the speed of sound, and can destroy a satellite. Okay, so that is another way of, generally in the past it was thought that space would be left as a neutral territory, but space is being weaponized. I have several links that I could send, with the weaponization of space. There are some very scholarly articles that are available for that. Okay. Now, at the same time, the scientists those who were involved and those who were not involved, were making attempts to put this genie back in the bottle, and there are varieties of respectable scientists from all over the world were involved in a conference that was held, I think it under the auspices of United Nations, at a place in Nova Scotia called Pugwash. And the the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, and none other than Albert Einstein, wrote a notice to the world, and this was that either renounce or perish. But obviously their words did not, succeed. And the statement is, in the future, nuclear weapons will be employed, and the continued existence of mankind, to realize and acknowledge that we have to make some type of peaceful means. And people who were participant of it were not just Einstein, but Frederick Joliot Curie, Marie Curie's other half, Hermann Mueller, who did the early experiments on fruit flies, and was a colorful man who moved from Colombia to Texas to Germany to Soviet Union. And he was the first one to prove that mutations inside fruit flies can be hastened up with X-rays. And after the war, after Hiroshima primarily, he was awarded with Nobel Prize and became a spokesman for disarmament. And at the same time, the famous chemist Linus Pauling, who got the Nobel Prize for it, Joseph Rotblat, who worked on the project, was very instrumental and spent a lot of energy and time working for nuclear disarmament. Okay, and some of this cleanup that was done on islands which are entrusted to United States, France, and Britain, where used as a playground or a test site. And some of these inhabitants of these islands were allowed to return to their homes after about 30 years. The tests were done in the 50s. Some of them were finally free in 1979. So, but this was a, Pugwash conference was a big page, and they have a nice, recent video as to what exactly happened, and very knowledgeable, I think. Now, obviously, those of you who grew up in the United States are very familiar with Cuban Missile Crisis, but for completeness sake, we need to get into some interesting details. Now, what inspired Nikita Khrushchev to start to venture into the Western Hemisphere? Part of it was his own insecurity and wanted to make sure that he was the big boy and can stand up to the evil West. And that time, the missile gap, which was touted by various presidents to continue build up, was always in the United States' favor. We talked about last time that while the Russians had about 80 weapons by the early 50s, United States by that time had almost 800. So there was always a superiority that, but the government was not anxious to admit that. And so that may be, and the other thing, even with the missile technology, United States had developed ICBM. The abbreviation stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, while the Russians had medium-range missiles. So he wanted to get a foothold to defend communist Cuba. And under the shadows of, they were able to ship them, and the U-2 spy planes were able to photograph and was brought to the attention of the young President Kennedy in 1960s. That precipitated the 13 days where the world almost came to the war, DEFCON 2. And Khrushchev's statement was that they were lagging behind us too. He just wanted to, why not throw a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants? And so that was one, and he definitely came close. Now this, okay. Now, and before that, I'm sorry, I missed my sequence. The higher and higher yield from the bombs was, now this is a YouTube link for a Tsar Bomba, which was the most powerful bomb, thermonuclear device that was exploded by the Soviet Union. A Tsar Bomba is, is obviously the word Tsar bomb. Okay, it's a Tsar bomb, the literal translation. It's the most powerful nuclear weapon ever created and tested. It was tested in 1961 before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, and somewhere in the areas of Soviet Union islands, and it remains the most powerful weapon. Okay, it was detonated, above ground. Okay, on a small island, Novaya Zemlya, 15 miles. Okay, and the detonation was secret, was detected by the U.S. intelligence agency, and it was measured at 50 megatons. Now, we talked about the Hiroshima bomb in kilotons. So we're talking about 1,000. So this is like, I'm sorry, let me do my math. Yeah, 50,000 times more powerful. So it's, okay, or maybe 5,000. I'm sorry, I'm doing my math wrong. Okay, so this is, this was the Tsar Bomba. And now, after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, they have declassified this, and this is one of their videos. Okay, that is there, the link, type of thing for those who want to see. But you can see this is a monster, and that has never been duplicated and has been notched down. So, and then that would literally wipe out not just several nations, but almost a whole continent. Okay, and so that's okay. Now, another incident that was a small footnote but was scary, was Russians had diesel and battery-powered submarines, and there were 4 submarines that were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and after the United States Navy had instituted a blockade of Cuba, until the Russians agreed. So the other submarines that Moscow was able to control them, and when Khrushchev decided to back down, he was able to call them back. But the 4th one had some had some run out of fuel, and they were running on battery powers, and they had lost contact. And that was armed with nuclear-armed torpedoes. and the United States Navy was dropping depth charges that they were banging off the side of the poor little submarine that was there. And the Russian policy was that no one commander of can launch by himself. There were three people with equal rank or power, and they all had to agree to launch. Now, 2 out of 3 were in agreement that yes, there is a war going on, the US Navy is attacking us. So we are a powerful Navy and we want to go down with glory. So they were ready to launch. But the third person, he said, I don't have official orders. I'm not going to agree with it. And for whatever reasons, the majority did not rule. They needed a uniform agreement. So the missile that was not launched. Now one can imagine the scenario that would have occurred if he had agreed to launch, that a nuclear missile would have landed anywhere within 1,000 miles of continental United States. And obviously, the US presidents with the hair trigger response would have been the force to respond, and the nightmare scenario, as you can imagine for yourself. Okay, I will not get into this right now. Now, something good did come out of it, that after this, shortly on the tails of it, nuclear test ban treaty was executed, and at least the three major powers agreed. The prickly French and the Chinese did not agree with it. And varieties of detection system and verification sensors were, and that system has still remained in progress. Okay, and obviously, I think you very well know, most of you know how the Cuban crisis agreed, that both times the steering contest was not won by either side. The United States agreed to pull the missiles out of Turkey, and the Soviet Union withdrew the missiles, and were able to extract the promise that the United States will not attack the island of Cuba. And so that still has continued. And obviously their fingers were burned already with the failed fiasco of Bay of Pigs. Okay, so this is, and there are varieties of other methods have been instituted since then. And that is the main role of a lot of these laboratories that we talked about, as to verify, detect and verify mission is big, not only just the radiation in the atmosphere that is to be detected, but earthquake, acoustic signatures, electromagnetic signatures, isotope detection, and detection from space, gamma radiation. All varieties of methods are put together to find a combined deterrent program. Okay, and this is varieties of it is very computer-based with different disciplines being involved. Okay, now the French, obviously they were at the losing end of the war, but they had the head start on radiation research, starting with the founder of the Lady Marie Curie and the royalty of nuclear physics. Now, after war, Charles de Gaulle had an ego bigger than his nose, and did not trust the Americans to defend themselves, so wanted an independence nucleus deterrent. But they had the reactor technology, but did not have enough technical know-how. So, now I think to make up for the Dreyfus incidents, they were very supportive of Israel. And by that time, the socialist leading president of Egypt, Abdel Gamal Nasser, had nationalized the Suez Canal, and that did not go well with the French, who had built the canal in the first place. So along with Israel, who was always being threatened by larger and better equipped Egypt, they decided to mount a secret operation to recapture Suez Canal. And under the guise of secrecy, they managed to put even attack the US embassy in Egypt, thinking that it was attacked by the Egyptians. Okay, but somehow that backfired and leaked, and the United States washed their hands off Israel. And the old world powers, Britain, who had financed the Suez Canal, and France, who had built the canal, okay, and Israel, who wanted to make sure that the canal stays in the Western hands, okay, mounted an operation, but that backfired, and the United States did not get involved due to the fear that the Russians would intervene as well. Now, so because of this, and also by 1954 in a place called Dien Bien Phu, the French were getting their nose bloodied by the communist, okay. So because of that, they decided to go ahead with their nuclear power. Now, by that time, they controlled Algeria, so they did the earlier nuclear testing in the Algerian deserts. Algeria is a big country, and after the war in Algeria got independence, they had some stewardship for some of the islands in Polynesia, so they moved to that theater and did the nuclear testing and successfully built an arsenal of a small but considerable power. And their collaboration with Germany and Italy did not work out very well. And then later on, they went on to develop thermonuclear, that is hydrogen bomb as well, in 1968. Okay, and on some atolls in the Pacific again. Okay, and that was so. So they became the fifth nuclear power at the same time. And currently, as of 2024, they have about 300 or so nuclear weapons, and along with nuclear armed submarines, and deterrent with their Mirage fighters. Okay, so they have the whole triad to to duplicate on a small scale. And the British nuclear weapons are under American control, and they need American okay to use. Okay, so that's, but France is totally independent out of NATO for their nuclear capabilities. Okay, so enough about that. Now, at the same time, these laboratories that are involved in the manufacture of these weapons, thousands of them, so they have always been a site for protest, and the laboratories have a schizophrenic attitude there. On one hand, the scientists would want to do research and share new technology with the people in their field. At the same time, the military and the companies that are running it, are more secretive and are top heavy. And initially, they were run by University of California and other universities, but they've later on, as it has happened, they have been switched to private contractor, this big arms manufacturers. Okay, and again, the cost contracts and overruns are a huge problem when with the combined public-private partnership, and that hasn't worked out as well. Okay, and sometimes the scientists are herded with with like similar to witch hunt, so to speak, that on one incident there was a missing disc, and that was eventually found, and all the scientists, reputable scientists, were subjected to severe FBI questioning. Okay. And this was the start of the RAND Corporation, the Research and Development Corporation, that is still very much in power, force to be reckoned with. Now, we didn't talk about one nation that is a nuclear capable, but is hushed and talked about, was Israel. After the Holocaust, the founding of Israel, right after that, they were in favor of developing nuclear weapons. So hopefully I can zoom in on this, and let's trace that as early as 1950, Israeli Jewish scientists were capable of Atomic Energy Commission, and followed by the cooperation program with the United States. United States in those days was not as much pro Israel, and they did not want them to acquire weapons. So they teamed up with France. France had the raw material and reactor technology, so that was shared. And then they started obviously, once you have the nuclear reactor, it is easy to reprocess the fuel and to make it weapons grade. So they secretly went on to do that. Now, and by mid-60s, they already had weapon, okay, and nobody actually, they did not declare it. And they collaborated with another Paria nation, South Africa. And there was a suspicion that in 1979, with their collaboration, a double radioactive blast was detected in the Indian Ocean, several hundred miles south of South Africa, and that was suspected to be a nuclear test, but it was hushed up by the Western and American news agencies, and it has never been investigated properly. Now, at the same time, the Israelis have the dog in the manger policy, and while they were very capable of nuclear deterrent, they prevented all the other Arab countries. Okay, the story goes back. They had attacked the Syrian nuclear reactor. Okay, and before that, they had attacked the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and they are itching to attack the Iranian nuclear reactor. Now, this is again, this may, I'm not religious, but this may be of interest that since Nixon and Golda Meir's days, okay, every U.S. president has signed a letter claiming that they will never admit publicly that Israel is nuclear capable. So that is a taboo subject, so to speak, and to be avoided at all costs. And the U.S. president and the Israeli ambassador almost insist on that letter. So it just shows how powerful that influence is in Washington. Okay, and Golda Meir, during one of the Egypt wars, I think in 72, brought out the nuke option almost close to, and that changed the United States' mind, and they sent in armaments. But so they were ready to lose it because that time they were crossed by during the Yom Kippur War, I think. They were caught by surprise, and the Egyptians had crossed the Suez Canal and were threatening Israel. They were on, for once they were on the winning side, so to speak. And there was Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir who were involved in it. And later on, the construction of the reactor, and the Israelis had almost hoodwinked the United States inspectors because obviously the Americans were not able to speak Hebrew, and they had created almost a dummy room, and they were shown the sites that the Israelis wanted them to see. So it's a very cloak and dagger story that is of interest as to how our so-called allies. And finally, one of the Israeli scientists had given the total story to, I think, London Times, and that's, at least in the European press, it's a well-known fact that the Israelis capable, and they have, at least currently, they have at least a couple of hundred weapons, but they don't have technical, type of weapons. So, that's where for that they have to rely on, the United States. Now, this is an interesting story, which I just learned a few days ago, 1914. The book written by the great H.G. Wells, the man with the great imagination, was called The World Set Free. Now, he was a science fan, and he was in touch with Rutherford, the founder of the nuclear science in Manchester, and then a guy named Soddy, who was a nuclear chemist. And based on interpretation and whatever little he had learned, he had imagined a massive nuclear weapon that could, with more power, and that was what any nation who possessed it would not want to use it because of the power. And so this was, and so that was the fictional story of World Set Free. This is before First World War, so you can see. And he had gone to the extent of even imagining a fictitious radioactive material, called carolinum. Okay, and this was, now it is possible that this might have inspired nuclear scientists to some extent after reading the fiction. Okay, so the novelist imagination was ahead of the real life. At the same time, the comic magazine Mad came about, but the word mad has different connotations or interpretation in the nuclear era, mutually assured destruction. And that term became much more in vogue after the nuclear arms race. This was coined by relatively, one can say literally, a mad scientist or evil genius named Herman Kahn, who was the brain behind the nuclear warfare. And he had proposed, he was a theoretician as well as, a policy wonk, so to speak, and he had proposed advised the U.S. government on various points. Okay, and it proposed the real workable concept that nuclear war can be actually won. Okay, and had put, from a limited warfare to how it can be escalated, and the sides with the more weapons would eventually win. And actually the people in the administration bought that. Okay, so, and he was caricatured in some of the movies. The movie that I need to bring to attention was Dr. Strangelove. It was a Stanley Kubrick classic with Peter Sellers, the British comic genius, playing multiple roles, and including a mad general who launches a unilateral attack on the Soviet Union, and the weapon system cannot be called back. And so that's an interesting take or satire on the nuclear arms race and the accidents that can occur. And George C. Scott, who played memorialized the role of Patton in the Second World War movie, history movie. Okay, plays the mad, general in charge of the Strategic Air Command, and you can just see how glibly they are talking. At the most, we'll have 20 million loss, okay, and we'll kill 180 million Russians. So it's a very well done movie about the horrors that of the war per se. Okay, all right. Moving on to this, the movie clip of Peter Sellers, but that's 8 minutes, and I'm not going to spend that much time on it because we've already at 1 hour, and I still have a lot more to go to. Okay, but you can, if you just Google the name and check on YouTube, you'll be able to find the hilarious clips of. And just to segue into the more modern times, the general who closets himself into one of the silos and the air base in the mountains of Dakotas. Okay, he's worried about his body fluids and fluoride. The commies are putting fluoride in the drinking water, and so that just reminds you of what our current health secretary is going on about the fluoride, and brain damage. So history repeats itself. Now, we talked earlier that the first initiative was something called the Strategic Air Command. The earlier general, who was a big man in the Second World War and was responsible for firebombing of Tokyo, where thousands of planes during night were sent over Tokyo, and almost, I think, close to 40 or 50,000 people died due to burns and damage, okay, with this massive air raids, because by that time, US had total air superiority over Japan, okay? And he was, after the war, he was the head of the Strategic Air Command. And obviously, at that time, they had very solid plans to wipe out major cities of Soviet Union by penetrating it from all directions, and with continuously circling armed B-52s. And so this was the atomic offense, And later on, after he resigned, he ran for vice president with the person who was against segregation, George Wallace, who ran independently as a third-party candidate in 1968 against Johnson. By that time, Johnson had dropped out, type thing. So after the infamous Chicago Convention, and the one Nixon won, but he was a third-party candidate and was able to siphon off some votes from Nixon, possibly. Okay. And now you think, and he was really a tough SOB, pardon the expression, that he was a key figure in developing of strategic bombing, okay, in the Pacific theater. And he believed that the power destroyed the enemy before they had a chance to launch first strike. Okay, so he solidified the importance of effective delivery system, and he trained people capable of penetrating the Soviet defenses. The effective nuclear deterrent was essential and of a constant state of readiness. Okay, and so this was now on the other side, one person who outdoes him was the man who followed him, general named Thomas Powers, and he was the head of the SAC in '57. And even people who worked under him were considering him as a cruel streak and not not a good person to work with. And he was responsible for something called the Operation Crossroads. And during the Cuban crisis, he put the SAC command on DEFCON 2 level, that is, almost one notch behind launching. And he gave the command on his own to the forces over non-scrambled channels. And whether it was intentional or deliberate breach of orders, that is still not clear. Okay, and may have played some role in, making Russians retreat, because obviously the Russians knew that Americans had numerical superiority. Okay, so this were and now all this changed after the entry of ICBM and submarine-based missiles. So the stack is still there, but it is only three. Now, NFU is the no first use policy. I mentioned that in my earlier classes that only two nuclear powers have the policy of no first use. They never use unless they have been attacked, Okay, and but while the United States still reserves the right, and this is a rehash of the old thing that the scientists, including Oppenheimer and people who work, they've said that this technology cannot be kept hidden, and our monopoly shall not last. And this was the United States. It took 10 months to, from test to bomb, and similarly, Russians only took 14 months. And the same way that Britain, because they have limited resources, took them a little longer. Okay, but they got there. French took a lot longer time, from nuclear reactors to actual development, and a similar time frame for Israel. They too collaborated. So you can see that once any nations had nuclear reactors, it didn't take them that long if they were determined to. So how they will succeed with Iran and North Korea, that remains to be seen. Okay, now the Chinese, after the communist takeover with Mao Zedong, they were very eager to acquire and become the big superpower because they were the members of the Security Council, and they had signed a secret agreement to obtain a nuclear uranium ore from the Soviets before they discovered their own mines. And they again very quickly started developing weapons. And this was not just the help from the Soviet technology, okay, but they had the scientists, their own caliber, who were capable people and had studied in the West and were pioneers in the Chinese nuclear. Okay, and in as early as 1964, they used the standard mode, uranium-235, and then followed quickly by the thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb. So again, so they became number 5. And now somewhere along the line, the powers of the Security Council, the big 5, so to speak, US, Russia, France, and Britain, and China, were become. Now the history of the Security Council is that apparently Nehru was invited, but he wanted the real communist China to be the member, not Taiwan, which was put in as a substitute by the Western power for as a member of the Security Council, permanent member of the Security Council on the United Nations, because it took a long time for China to join UN. Okay, and it took until 70s. So the nuclear arms race has not become exclusive, and you can see that the numbers have gone up substantially and have kind of leveled off a little bit, but there are still huge numbers of weapons are available around the world. Okay, 5,000 for Russia and United States, and a smaller number for other countries. And we'll talk about the other countries as we go along. Okay, and again, this is an interesting side, but hopefully I can show this to you. Okay, if I click on the flags, you can just see rising and pulling back. The United States went on from 1950, okay, to as high as 60,000. I mean, this is like unreal to believe, type of thing. Okay, and then just, okay, and falling back, okay, and then rising and pulling back. This is Russia. Okay. These are total versus, operational. So there are, you can look at the legend type of thing, and it gets a little too academic. Okay. Can you see if we can? Okay, I'm sorry, I went back. That's my mistake. Okay, United Kingdom. Oops. It doesn't go further, so let's try one more time, hopefully. Yeah, no, I think it doesn't work on the other side. So I think I did not put more this thing. So, okay, this is where we'll leave it at, rising and pulling back of the Soviet Union and the global. Okay, and and this is another pictographic graphic, very well done slides, that okay. Okay, and this is 2023. Okay, how many weapons each country has 4,000, 3,000, so it just gives you the idea of the number. Okay, and and the other countries, yeah, I'm sorry, it was a different slide. That's why it didn't show up. United Kingdom, okay, China and France, these are all on this slides, right? So it comes in this thing. And Israel, India are on this graph. So I have separated all the countries that have as to how they have gradually increased over here. You can see the time line at the bottom and have numbers have gone up gradually, okay, including the green is the Pakistan, and North Korea is right at the bottom. Israel is somewhere here. So as to how they started in 70s, India started had started earlier, but in 1996 they took off. So these are their numbers. Okay, so this explains the sizes too. Sorry, but these were separate. That's why so because there were two, otherwise the slide would have been too jumbled. Okay, and this is nuclear arms. 69, 65. Okay, as you can see, the numbers were 27,000 for one United States. So the numbers are staggering. And then finally, there's some wisdom has prevailed. The numbers have decreased gradually. And this is where we stand in 2023. This were from the New York Times graphics as usual. So thanks for that. And we already talked about in the last class about the major disasters. And we already talked about the third man who would not launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. Okay, and I have a new slide coming up for this. And the accidents we already talked about. This was the major Russian accident that was hushed. The wind scale fire that took place. The others are much well known. So and we talked about them on day 2. Okay. This is the guideline that the attempts were taken place for reducing the nuclear arsenal. Okay, partial test ban treaty, complete test ban treaty that took place in 1999. And I have individual slides for coming up and who were the actors involved in it. So, but this just gives you a brief summary of the various abbreviation of the Strategic SALT Treaty and SALT 1. Okay, and the last one was ready to expire in 2026. So what will happen, that remains to be seen. But this is a chart of or timeline of the attempts at reducing and verifying. Now, and I think this is a little out of sequence slide, but we already talked about the Nevada National Site, okay, and that is well known. So I think I have gone over that, that the sites were carried out before, and earlier. Finally, the detente, the first word for detente took place, between Gromyko and Leonard Brezhnev and Nixon, okay, and limit the number of nuclear. So finally, they become the most apparent strategic arms control that was carried out during the heydays of Vietnam War, and that forged a pair of groundbreaking agreement in 72, ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, okay, and SALT II Treaty, number of nuclear missile silos and submarine-based for a 5-year period. So that was really a good start between the two enemies. Okay. Now at the same time, India is a weird case. Okay. Hi, sorry about the interruption. So we were talking about this series of how India managed to get the weapons. They had enough talented physicists who had trained at Cambridge, and one enterprising nuclear physicist named Homi Bhabha, who was Zoroastrian ancestry, and he, right after independence, he had advocated nuclear reactors for energy, for electricity. And Jawaharlal Nehru, who was Indian Prime Minister, was in favor of it, and he funded him. And obviously, at that time, they did not have raw material, they did not have uranium, but the Atoms for Peace program that Eisenhower started came in right at the right time, and Canada sold India nuclear heavy water reactor, and obviously they were able to enrich fuel out of it, and Homi Bhabha wanted to get nuclear, but Nehru was Gandhi's follower and advised against it about weaponizing. Finally, after getting a bloody nose by the Chinese, Nehru's daughter, who became the prime minister, decided to go with a nuclear device and did what they call peaceful demonstration device in 1974 in the deserts of Rajasthan, the area, desert area in the border. And finally, after they lost the power, the second party, which was more right-leaning Hindu party, BJP, which is currently in power, decided to become nuclear because primarily due to the fact that they wanted to, just like France, they wanted to be independent and project power. And wisely, they had not signed the nuclear proliferation treaty, so they were able to, obviously there were protests, but there was all indigenous technology. So, and with the rise of China, the second Bush decided to accept India grudgingly as a power and to be followed by Pakistan on its tail. Another tale on it is that in 1947, when India became independent, a small princely state in the southern part called Trivandrum was rich in thorium. And because of this thorium reserve, which was useful for the atomic energy, the minister wanted to that state to stay independent and apply for United Nations membership and make a treaty with United States and Britain for selling thorium and manage independence in a real extreme south corner of Indian Republic. Luckily, Nehru and various diplomats were able to talk them out of it. And finally, the state of Trivandrum joined, the state of Kerala, which is, southernmost state, or Coromandel on the southern coast and of India. But that is digressing, so probably more than you would care to know. But I did a class on the princely state at one time, so I learned a lot more about it at that time. Okay, and then again, now followed in 79, the Arms Reduction Treaty fell by the wayside, and that's with the SALT II, with the invasion of Afghanistan, the Russians, Vietnam. Now, at the same time, I already mentioned the double flash disk was detected. Now, by that time, Jimmy Carter was the president, and he boycotted the Olympics, as you may recall. And he was one of the few qualified nuclear engineers who was the president. And he decided against building neutron bomb, which has a very destructive power for destroying property, okay, and so-called, to release large portion of energy as neutrons, fast neutrons, rather than the explosion. So the heat effects are not eliminated, but the radiation is released, which is the major source of casualties. So you can kill people, but not the property. Okay, so that's a more devastating weapons. And there are rumors that Israel may have that, but that remains to be proven. Okay, now with the collapse, with there more and more protests that were going on, with the Pershing missiles in Germany, you can see the protest movement in Germany for 10 years off and on, that just went on. Okay, and this is, I promised earlier that I would talk about the man who averted World War III, is the man named, Stanislav Petrov. Okay, he was at the command center in Russia, and when a missile launch was suspected to be detected, he decided, judged that it was a false alarm, and again did not launch the retaliatory attack because they were quite a ways from Moscow and they were not able to get in touch. So he could have, that this was, and it was indeed confirmed that this was a satellite warning that had malfunctioned. So the triggers, have occurred many times in the world. Okay. Similarly, a NATO exercise was misinterpreted by the Soviet Union. Okay, again in the same. So this was one world has been just lucky, type of thing. Now again, when Reagan won the presidency, he came up with concept called Star Wars, and the strategic defense. And this was again the idea that was proposed by the father of the H-bomb, Edward Teller. Okay, and so he was the brainchild behind it. Now, obviously, this scared the Russians and again brought them to the table of nuclear freeze to some extent. Perhaps it's because of the amount of expense. Although at the same time, the U.S. even with intention, they would not have been capable because the technology wasn't there. Okay, and the scientists were not skeptical, were skeptical that this could be actually be initiated. And again, the concept, as I mentioned in the first class, is being revived by Trump, putting in something called the Golden the Dome over the United States, and to imitate what Israel has called the Iron Dome. Okay, and now this is a movie that was made by Hollywood the day after about what could really happen in a nuclear disaster called The Day After. And it's a very graphic, well-done movie as to how Soviet Union decides to attack with 300 missiles and what happens in Kansas. So it's starring Jason Robert and John Lithgow as some of the characters. So, but that's I think again because of copyright, I'm not going to show this to you. I may share this when after I stop my recording on going on YouTube. Okay. Okay, and this was another movie that was instrumental in changing public opinion called War Games, where a young kid, I think that was Matthew Broderick, gets into NORAD and simulates a Russian launch. And finally, it was all computer-generated imaging, and the generals managed to lose the control. And they learned the lesson that this is not a war that is winnable by playing a game called TikTok. Okay, so that was a very well done, entertaining movie as to how even the gamers or the hackers, as they later on came to be called, can break into a very supposedly secure systems. Okay, and this was finally when Gorbachev became the Secretary of Soviet Union in Iceland. The summit was held, and this was unraveled over missile defense testing system and the SDIs, but at least some attempts were made at reducing the arsenal. Okay, and this was again that later on some more treaties about the intermediate-range missiles and verification was always issued, and both sides had inspector going on each side to verify that yes, that they were holding to the letter of the law, so to speak. Okay, again, during Bush and Gorbachev era, the strategic arms talk was started. Just as a side note, the woman named Susan Eisenhower during this one of these events was introduced to a Russian physicist and fell in love and was one of her second or third husband. Okay, so detente was occurring in personal relationship as well. Okay, and this was the Cold War, end of Cold War era, and the various Soviet stance, and Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapon, which they may regret it, and some of them got handsome payment, and after the Russians' weapons were deconditioned, the United States bought a lot of the uranium for use in the nuclear power plant. So they got their well-needed cash supplement. Okay, and this is again, the varieties of open skies and Soviet republics disarmed type thing. So which we already mentioned about the Kazakhstan had huge number of weapons. So did Ukraine and Belarus. Okay, so that the armed spread was reduced because there was a real danger that the Islamic countries may acquire access to the weapons, and some of the scientists who had lost their job may work for some of the rogue characters. Okay, and finally the complete test ban treaty was carried out, and the last some of the laggards, France and China, continued to do testing. Okay, and so finally, the testing above ground and even underground has been stopped, Okay, and that has caused considerable difficulty for the scientists because they have to simulate this on a computer-generated, almost realistic image that requires some massive computing power. And you can see that how they can recreate models set to the yield of the weapons that would take place, and that requires, with the amount of radio energy, and the calculations are rather massive. And this problem has been in existence since the days of Manhattan Project. Some of you may recall that we mentioned von Neumann, who actually, for doing the calculation, actually just for good measure, devised his own computer called Maniac, which helped the earlier Manhattan Project calculations of the yield and how to concentrate the energy in the implosion lenses and technology. And this was again required that the more powerful weapons required more powerful, and so simultaneously computer technology advance on the tail of nuclear weapons. And this requires more powerful supercomputers. And finally, I think hopefully I think I might be able to show this, that the more powerful supercomputer called El Capitan has come online at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories.
El Capitan is the DOE National Nuclear Security Administration's first exascale machine. As the world's most powerful machine, it will be greater than 2 exaflops. To put that in perspective, most modern cell phones are on the order of 2 teraflops. You would need 1 million cell phones to equal the power of El Capitan.
El Capitan is going to be used primarily to support the nuclear deterrent mission of the NNSA, which is the stockpile stewardship mission, supporting the enduring stockpile that we have, understanding issues of aging and making sure that we can assess the stockpile as being safe, secure, and reliable.
Having access to an exascale computer for our national security mission is going to be tremendous. The Tri-Labs, San Diego, Los Alamos, Livermore, all have important questions that they need to be answered. One of the big national security implications of having an exascale machine is the life extension program and the modernization program.
Our mission at the lab has increased in complexity dramatically over the past 10 to 15 years. We had 2 modernization programs kind of come online at the same time, and those had new requirements for modeling and simulation.
So with El Capitan, we're expecting breakthrough performance gains on our multiphysics applications, not just on node performance, but the scale. The sheer number of unknowns we'll be able to solve for is going to be unprecedented.
So Sierra, the previous advanced technology system at Livermore Computing, was a 125 petaflop peak system. El Capitan is more than 20 times as capable as Sierra.
This is the fastest supercomputer we've ever deployed in the National Nuclear Security Administration. The potential for science on this machine is amazing. Not just in the national security enterprise with El Capitan, but also in the general open science enterprise with Tuolumne.
Tuolumne is a smaller version of El Capitan. Its mission is to do unclassified science for the entire laboratory and our collaborators.
It will be a world-class resource used to solve problems in materials science, nuclear structure, astrophysics, climate science, and many others.
So partnership is everything for building a system of this scale. It's a system we've been working with HPE and AMD to deploy here at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. We've been working hand in hand with each other, not only to get the system built, but to get the applications ready so that on day one, the system is effective for our needs.
El Capitan has been extraordinary, really, from start to finish.
We're very excited about the significant innovations in the system. This includes HPE's Rabbit modules, which are near node local storage.
Okay, so I think it's a fairly long video, but you just get the general idea of it, And there are other similar powerful computers that are at all the laboratories. Oak Ridge, as usual, Aurora, Argonne, which is south of Chicago, a few miles, has their own share. So they're trying to guess what would happen with real life testing and see how powerful these weapons will be in future as they. Okay. And then again, we talked about the Comprehensive Ban Treaty, type of thing that took place. And they are reduced to doing a subcritical experiments under simulated situations, And then again, sometimes there is a problem with the designers or the manufacturers of the industrial power that sometimes they're what they say the system is capable of doing, they're not. So they've been notified as to correct this based on the computer simulation testing. So there is really some quality control issues that they're able to detect with the problems with the supercomputers. And at the same time, they are trying to detect the sensors that I alluded to earlier with the GPS and underground sensor system. So these laboratories are maintaining varieties of functions. Now, the Pakistan is an unusual case that, on the tails of the Indian nuclear plant, Pakistani Prime Minister Bhutto was in favor of building nuclear arsenal and they were going to get some help from the Chinese, and this is after the separation of East Pakistan, that he was anxious to build their own initiative, and he was helped by a scientist who was a metallurgist working for a Dutch company that was involved in some of the nuclear metallurgy manufacturing. and he was able to secretly copy some of the data, classified data, and pass it on to Pakistan. And okay, so we were talking about A.Q. Khan. So not only he masterminded the Pakistani nuclear program, by this time they've had enough help from China, because the old logic of enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's why the Chinese helped the Pakistanis in many ways, with the so-called Belt Initiative, as well as with the nuclear testing. And obviously Pakistan owes a huge amount of loans with China. And they conducted their own nuclear tests, in 1998 on the tails of India, and unfortunately they were not just limited to their own country. A.Q. Khan was a rogue scientist, and he managed to sell the technology for personal gains under the nose of Pakistan to countries such as Libya, Iran, and even Saudi Arabia was offered, North Korea. So he helped a lot of countries. And initially, after this was exposed by the United States and the Western countries, he was jailed for a short time under house arrest or something, but then eventually he was rehabilitated and is still considered a very respectable figure in Pakistan nuclear history. Was the one who masterminded and started the whole thing going. Okay, so that's another story. And at the same time, North Korea was, the founder of North Korea, one of the Kims, I can never keep them straight, as to he had asked for Soviet help and almost blackmailed Soviets into helping. And by 1980s, they had trained their own scientists abroad and who were capable. They signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and left again, and then again. This thing was that they removed the nuclear arsenal from South Korea, but even then they continued to develop, because this was their big stick with which they can, keep stay as a thorn in the side of the United States. With depending upon who was in power in the United States, the various time negotiations came fruitful during the Clinton and even during Obama administration to some extent, but then Trump had his own initiative where they met in Hanoi, but again, they could never come to the term, and he gave the world stage to the grandson of Kim Jong. Okay, and they had the meeting in Hanoi, and it's still, it's a very open issue, and they can still be considered so-called axis of evil and the mad kings. Okay, and the Iranians had their own fear. And this is their timeline for, I think, if we wanted to see and they're capable of enrichment. And this is the first time United States and Israel did something called cyber warfare by inserting a computer virus that disable a lot of their enrichment machines and set back their program for a number of years, okay, or at least a few years. This was followed by the attack and assassination by Israel of their prominent nuclear scientist. Okay, and still Israel apparently is still itching to prompt the United States into attacking Iranian nuclear sites, but they are underneath the mountains and their bunkers. So, and Israel does not have so-called bunker-busting bombs, so that may be the limiting factor. How that will pan out, that remains to be seen. Okay, and then again, the varieties of sword and missile defense systems have been initiated during the Bush and Putin era of a sort. This was called a Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty. They have all sorts of acronyms, and the Moscow Treaty that was carried out. But again, with the invasion of Ukraine, that has all fallen by the wayside. Now, this is a very powerful reference book as to who has what and what type. So this is only for the military heads. These are the varieties acronyms of what type of ICBMs they have. And this is probably a lot more than you would ever care to know about, as to what type of bombers we have, the Russians have, what type the United States have. Obviously, a lot of us in our country, we are familiar with the F-35 fighter planes and the delivery system. And there are some of the Chinese, and they're catching up with very quickly. And these have been how old they are, how much what they are in production. So this is a lot more detailed site than you'd care to know, unless you are a really military history buff. so to speak. So, and you can see there are all types of air launch, intercontinental, short range, long range, submarine launch. And the submarine launched are the most lethal because one submarine is capable of launching, at least several missiles, and they're hard to detect, when they can be anywhere in the ocean. So that remains a big threat. Okay. Okay, and this is again, the modernization plan that has been carried out by, on the U.S. side, by various administrations. You can trace the line that dates back from. Let's see if I can. I think I can find my magnifying lens. Okay, but you can see here, and that these are the classic B-52 bombers from the Second World War era. Now they're replaced by B-2, and then the future, more futuristic plane, and their future system called B-21. Okay, and again, the current Minutemen are of the workhorse of United States, the ground-based missiles, so they're going to be replaced again as well. And then the submarine, the Ohio class submarines that were there, that will be replaced, and the Polaris submarines will be replaced by something called the Columbia class at a great cost again. So I'll have the data coming for that for those who want to know more a little bit about how expensive programs these are going to be. And the biggest workhorse of this is that of all the nuclear system is called the plutonium pits. That is the explosive power. And that was manufactured at two places in the United States, the old good old Rocky Flats in Colorado, north of Denver, Colorado, and part of it would be, at Savannah River. And again, they've had their problems, and which we talked about in the first lecture. Okay. Okay. Now the question remains: is it really necessary? Are they still working? And are they still going to be safe? But the race continues. And now this is Savannah River plant. It has any nuclear plant loses a lot of water, and some of the oldest inhabitants of the earth, the alligators, are drinking contaminated water. So they are a good laboratory for what happens to a life form with radiation exposure. Again, the various biologists are studying and tagging these alligators and checking their blood samples and so forth. So that is a good test subject that is going on, right under in the waters here, Savannah River. Okay, so this is, if you're interested in that biology, you can click on this video type thing. But it's, it was an interesting site. Okay. Okay. And then there are the varieties of subcritical tests that are still carried out, and in a place called Mercury, Nevada. And then again, some of this have led to, when the companies manufactured this, have led to varieties of actions. Okay. And then there are varieties of expansion plants that are under consideration at great cost of this type of testing. And in the old days, with the subcritical testing, the government used to give out public notices, but they have stopped doing that now. Okay, so that may be going on, but okay, during the Clinton era, there was again some attempts were done to reset some of the nuclear arms reduction. But again, with the change in administration, that has fallen by the wayside. Okay. Okay. And now some of this is sometimes, there's and the storage of the waste material has become a problem, and a simple problem of not knowing what type of material should be used, that used wrong type of agent was used, and that caused the heat, the storage material that was used exploded, okay, and caused radiation leak enough to create something called 700 dirty bombs. Okay, and so this was the explosion that occurred, at waste isolation pilot plant. Okay, somebody did not understand the biochemistry of the organic material that was stored along with in this radiation waste. Okay. Okay, and Donald Trump, in his infinite wisdom, decided to withdraw from the treaty, INF treaty. Okay, and again, changing the whole paradigm shift. Okay, all right, I'm gonna go over some of these for sake of time because we are coming up to our time limit. Okay, and where it is the Russians have, again, the START talk was started, that has been extended till 2026. Now, let's dwell into the modernization plan. That was the last part of the talk, that, so arms control fact sheets, so this is things that I don't know if I can click on this and open it, easily. Okay, I'll get to that later. Okay, modernization has a huge cost, it's multi-billion dollars of the replacing the whole triad, the missiles, submarines, and the ground-based, that's underway. Okay, this is a Australian video on the nuclear weapon modernization program. So I don't know if it's under copyright or not, but
in the 1940s, scientists and engineers changed the world forever when they invented the atomic bomb. In the Cold War.
So, but it's a almost a 1 hour long video. So I think I will have the link that, you can click on, if you choose to, type of thing, but it's too long to play for. And it's really for the arms aficionado type of thing. So, and he goes into very nauseating details. So
in the 90s.
Okay, and this is again, the Russian Tsar, or Vladimir Putin, so this was the nuclear resort, if their territories. So these are his statements, which I thought they were worth putting in the, okay, when their attack is vital. Okay. And so they are not about using nuclear options. So they're changing their policy completely, and you can see what the Russian military control that goes on in Ukraine. So this is, again, real and clear and present danger, as Tom Clancy would say. Okay. And this was some of the, and the Biden administration was getting ready for three enemies sort of combining, and a lot of military strategies are saying that the United States need to be prepared for a coordinated attack. Okay, and this was again, and that may be partly by the Chinese president Xi Jinping's deterrent of, instead of maintaining minimum deterrent, to match the size of United States. And this is some of the ideas of the cost. Majority of research and development funding goes towards defense. Health and Human Services only gets 26%. Okay, and NASA gets only 8%. And while they're trying to cut the other National Science Foundation, that's just the peanuts compared to that. And this is the military spending. This is top 40 countries. You can see we are the number one in terms of spending money for defense. Okay, and so followed by China, Russia, and even India, Saudi Arabia. So this is, the world spends a lot of money for defense. Okay, and this is the United States triad, that's, we already talked about it, and the submarine based, which is the most lethal, the air launched, the air delivered cruise missiles. Okay. Now, this does not take into account the drone technology. That is totally a different can of worms altogether. And the Minuteman missiles we already talked about, they'll be replaced. Okay, and these are the actual more data than you'd care to know for the old Minuteman missiles, will be replaced by something called Sentinel. Again, the cost is, nothing to sneeze at. The warheads, the W-78, will be replaced by another one. Okay, and all the states, they're independent and they have their self-interest, because this weapons production brings a lot of jobs. And the missiles, they'll be replacing 400 missiles and command centers in the states, the Minuteman missiles, the western states primarily, that are buried under the fields, and that brings a lot of jobs and a lot of money. So the states have a vested interest in continuing this, rearmament link in through the Congress. Now the bomber force, again, the old B-52 will be retired by more advanced ones, and at a cost of almost $1 billion itself, so, and the bombs will be replaced, again, so this is just more data than one would care to know. Okay, and the plutonium pits, which are the brainchild of the thing. And And at the same time, uranium will also be built at Oak Ridge plant, and the plutonium plates will be primarily manufactured at Los Alamos and Savannah River, and it would employ, hundreds of people and for a number of years. So that okay, and the submarines, again, the Ohio class will be replaced by the Columbia class, and the cost is almost like $1 billion. Okay, and this is in the Atlantic side, New England states, which are primarily involved. So they have General Dynamics Corporation. They're going to build more tonnage in next 30 years than in the entire Cold War. They've already hired 5,000 people, and they'll be hiring some more. And these submarines are each under construction, the largest America has ever built. Okay, and and this will cost is, hold your breath, $11 billion per one. Okay, and they're building at least 12, so you can do the math. Okay, and it is different than spacecraft, because spacecraft has only 2 or 3 crew. Submarine has to have 100 people surviving the crushing ocean pressure. So, and for weeks and months together. So it's a very expensive proposition. Okay, now this are the varieties of states that are involved, mostly in the South. Okay, Savannah River, some in Texas, the old standby Sandia and other stuff. So I think we have covered for almost 2 hours, and I think I'm not going to be able to show the. Okay, I'll stop this particular share. Okay, I'll pause recording earlier. So let me go to switch screens. Okay, and okay, I will share screen 1. Okay, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. Okay, and this were the 4 YouTube sites that I have. Okay, and this is the thing on the movie the day after.
Confidence is high.
This is the movie day after. I mean, it's a very dramatized version of Hollywood at its best. Okay, you can just and this is the real explosion that takes place, so and this is the classic scene, that how well they did it before the days of computer simulation. Okay, so it was a very well done movie as to what really happens. Okay, so you get the idea that that was a very well done movie. Okay, and this is the classic scene from War Games. Sorry, this is a commercial, so on YouTube, which we cannot get rid of. And this is where the kid, played by Matthew Broderick, is trying to. And the NORAD supercomputer gets caught in the. Okay, so you've seen this movie clip, okay, and that was from War Games. Okay, this is the famous movie Dr. Strangelove.
Alexa, please, I beg you. I don't have a phone. Dawid Sadzki. Ja z versterktem merk in Mafia Patagonia. Com prosit Minas Casals, no yes, Leons Kazum, stelle mit der Tag. Ja. Ja. Ja, dat je me verwacht. Da. Alles zo. Mijn ja, dat was het stellen. I've done as you asked. Be careful, Mr. President. I think he is drunk.
Hello? Hello, Dimitri. Listen, I can't hear too well. He had a sort of, well, he went a little funny in the head. You know, just a little funny. And he went and did a silly thing. Well, I'll tell you what he did. He ordered his planes to attack your country. Well, let me finish, Dimitri. Let me finish, Dimitri. Well, listen, how do you think I feel about it? Can you imagine how I feel about it, Dimitri? Why do you think I'm calling you? Just to say hello? Of course I like to speak to you. Of course I like to say hello. Not now, but anytime, Dimitri. I'm just calling up to tell you something terrible has happened. It's a friendly call. Of course it's a friendly call. Listen, if it wasn't friendly, you probably wouldn't have even got it. They will not reach their targets for at least another hour. I am positive, Dimitri. Listen, I've been all over this with your ambassador. What? I see. Just ask Vronsky information. I'm sorry too, Dimitri. I'm very sorry. All right, you're sorrier than I am. But what's happening?
Okay, so I think it's a long clip, but I think if you are interested, you can find it. And this is, the plan to start 3 Mile Island. We already talked about that. So that's a clip for that, about the Microsoft and other Quest companies. And this is the John Oliver segment on HBO that you can find last week. So it's an old video, but still very valid. So hopefully it was fun, and I will stop the share and stop recording. Okay. All right, folks. Okay. I'll see you next time.